Thank you, Acting President, and I'm pleased to rise to speak to this omnibus bill on firearms, control of weapons, the sex offenders registration and Victoria Police. I support much of this legislation. I certainly support responsible gun ownership. And I think that many parts of this bill go towards that and go to rectify issues that possibly could have been rectified some time ago. But I can't support the further bedding down, the further trampling down of in relation to the firearms protection orders. As we said back in 2018, these completely trample on fundamental human rights. Once a firearm protection order has been made, it allows police officers without warrant or consent to enter and search the premises of the person subject to the firearm protection order. It also allows them to search other persons present. This could be in a car. Someone could be in a car with someone with a firearms protection order, and the police could stop that car and search not the person with the firearms protection order, but the passenger in that car, but including children. It allows police to search people without warrant, even without suspicion. They don't even have to have suspicion for them to do this. They don't have to have reasonable suspicion that a person has committed an offence. The person subject to an FPO does not have to have ever even acquired, possessed, carried, used or owned a firearm. Firearm protection orders can be made because of the behaviour of a person. That behaviour is undefined in the Act. Or because of the people that person associates with. Firearm protection orders can even be made to children as young as 14. It basically dispenses with all of the normal processes involved in the issuing of warrants, and that's why we argued back in 2018 that if you were going to issue a firearms prohibition order, that at least there would be some oversight by the Magistrates Court. Now, that wasn't allowed, and even back there in 2018, the Statement of Compatibility conceded that this piece of legislation was not proportionate to the limitations of human rights under the Victorian Charter. And I think this is the interesting thing about our Charter sometimes, is that we talk about the wonderful Charter that we have, and I do believe it is a wonderful Charter, and I am a passionate proponent of the Charter. But when we can introduce legislation that says it actually tramples every single right that we have in the Charter, but we think that that is okay. Now, I know that I am not the only person deeply offended by this. I know that Liberty Victoria was deeply offended by this when these changes were made back in 2018. And now to add insult to injury, to say that, this should be an incredibly serious order that really, I would say that only a court should make, but okay, we've dispensed with that. We've said that senior police officers can make this, but now this bill is amending that to say no, junior police officers can make this. Police officers, inspectors in stations can make firearms prohibition orders. And let's just remember, if you have a firearm prohibition order issued against you, this means that anyone even with you can be searched without warrant. This means that your house can be searched without warrant. This means that if you are visiting a house, it can be searched without warrant. Now, as someone who chaired the inquiry into firearms prohibition legislation, and heard considerable evidence around this. This legislation, in particular, this section on extending the ability of who can issue firearms prohibition orders is, I would put it kindly, a solution looking for a problem. Because at the time that we conducted the inquiry, there was no backlog, there was no concern that people weren't getting issued with firearm prohibition orders because no one...
Order, Ms. Patten, sorry, calling standing order. I have to interrupt business and call the Minister. Minister?
Thank you, President. Pursuant to standing order 408, I declare the sitting be extended by up to 1 hour.
Thank you. Member to continue.
Thank you, Minister. And I'm surprised by the interjections that you received from Mr. Finn, because I thought he was listening to every word that I was speaking about. No, thank you, Mr. Finn, because in many ways I'm actually supporting some of the amendments that your party. This is actually incredibly serious. When we start seeing this type of legislation that we know completely breaches our Charter of Human Rights, completely tramples on it, and yet we're not only saying that that it tramples on it, but we should allow far more people to exercise this right. I can't even fathom where this is coming from. I can't fathom where this is coming from. Certainly when we looked at this, not, it's COVID time, so 2019 may seem like a decade ago, but it was only in 2019, in November 2019, less than 2 years ago. This is not, what we see here in this bill is not what the committee recommended. Sure, there's parts, no, this is not what the committee recommended. In fact, we were concerned by the level of discretion that this legislation allowed. We were incredibly concerned by the ability for these orders to be issued, and that we thought that it could lead to inconsistent practices and confusion. In fact, we were pretty firm about this. We noted that the VCAT case that actually led to the inquiry, in some ways, this showed the trampling and the overarching and the heaviness of this legislation, that the reason VCAT heard the case and in actual fact overturned those firearms prohibition orders, and I note that obviously that order was changed, was because they thought it overrode. They thought that it was beyond what was acceptable. That yes, certainly someone with a firearms prohibition order should be contained by certain orders, but to be prohibited from dropping his children off at his mother-in-law's house because his father-in-law had a firearms license, that was an overstep. And this bill just treads down on that overstep. that is what this bill does. To now say that, in actual fact, it doesn't need to be senior officers, and now it just needs to be an inspector that can now do this. I can't even begin to understand why we're even doing this. And, you know, and I look at the recommendations that our inquiry made, and I thought that many of them were actually quite reasonable. That the Commissioner of Police could possibly make, you know, that could amend a firearms prohibition order. And just in small things like the circumstance I mentioned earlier, that you might be able to say to someone who had an FPO that they could drop their children off with their grandparents, even though that grandparent had a licence for a firearm. But that's not where they went. They ignored the findings of the report. They ignored the recommendations of the report, with the exception of the recommendation 3, where we suggested that they amend the legislation to include a requirement that a person subject to a firearms prohibition order must provide notification of change of address. Well, I'm pleased that they do that. I note in Mr Quilty's contribution that they must do that within a week. A day, and those under sex offender register orders have a week to do that. Look, I am really troubled by this piece of this part of the legislation, and I don't think we should dispense with fundamental human rights to relieve a bit of workload pressure. And when in 2019, the police did not report workload pressure. They did not report this. They did not report that this was the difficulty with the legislation. Now we're hearing that they would like to issue far more. And remember that this legislation, because it tramples on so many human rights, that this is meant for the most serious of serious criminals. And so why are we expanding this? Why are we making this easier? Again, as I say, you know, if we have a Charter of Human Rights, we should adhere to it. And this legislation does not do that. Now, I can support many aspects of this bill. There are many areas where I think it's sensible. There are many areas where I think it's just promoting responsible gun ownership, or it's changing other parts of legislation like the sex offender register scheme that are purely sensible. But this part, it worries me. It worries me. And while I will support most parts of the bill, I cannot support the clauses on the firearms prohibition orders.
Thank you.